Shaken by this week's unprecedented strikes. All of New York, indeed all of the world today, stands with prayers to remember the dead and to reflect on the enormity of what has happened over the past week. President George Bush had said that he hadn't gone earlier. He didn't want to hamper the very difficult, the very arduous task of the rescue services. Just waiting now for the helicopter to take off, carrying George W. Bush. Not clear how many officials he'll take with him. He's made it clear he doesn't want to be the president of photo opportunities. He hasn't appeared at any of the sites, wanting to get on with his own business. A lot of security and political meetings as the nation tries to come to terms with what happened and also to decide on the appropriate response. At a prayer service a short time ago, President Bush emphasized that America would retaliate at a time of its choosing. Different views being expressed as to what shape that should take and when exactly it should come. Today, the FBI published a list of the 19 hijackers who were involved in the 4 aircraft which were hijacked on Tuesday. These are the live pictures from the St. Andrews Air Force Base. Across the United States, it's a national day of prayer and remembrance. The whole nation stopping to reflect on this week's devastating strikes. President George W. Bush coming out of the helicopter there. President Bush walking across the tarmac, very much having to send a signal to the nation, not just that he's in charge, but that the authorities will now do everything possible to protect the nation at a time when the country is feeling very much vulnerable. Not just in the United States, but also in Europe, it was a day of remembrance. Here in Europe, it was a 3-minute moment of silence as the Europeans stopped also to reflect on what has happened this week in the United States. President George W. Bush leaving now, saying goodbye as he heads off to New York. America, he said, will react at an hour of its choosing. Every word, every sentence of the president is being scrutinized, not just in the United States, but around the world. And of course, in Afghanistan itself, where the main suspect in this case continues to be Osama bin Laden, the Saudi dissident believed to be living in Afghanistan. That's where he has resided for many years now, ever since the Afghan war began in the 1980s. United States authorities have been holding discussions with Pakistan, the main backer of the Taliban, to enlist their cooperation in the event of any American military strike. It's not been confirmed yet exactly what form the retaliation would take, but if indeed it is confirmed that Osama bin Laden's network is behind this week's devastating strikes, the United States has made it absolutely clear that they can expect a devastating response. I'm Lise Doucette. You're watching BBC World as we continue to bring you live coverage of the events following Tuesday's devastating strikes against New York and Washington. An unprecedented act of terrorism, the most audacious act ever seen anywhere in the world. To recap now the main news, America will react at an hour of its choosing. President George W. Bush's words a short time ago at a memorial service for the victims of this week's attack, a multi-faith service held at the Washington National Cathedral. And shortly before the service began, the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a resolution authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force to respond to the attacks. There are now plans to move supplies to an American Air Force base in the Indian Ocean and to mobilize up to 50,000 military reservists. The president is now, as you've just seen, on his way to New York, and there he'll see the thunderstorms and the pouring rain, which have slowed the efforts of the stoic rescue workers.
There seemed to be a tear in almost every eye as the American establishment came together to remember at the National Cathedral in Washington. President Bush had come from making a fresh appeal to the Israeli Prime Minister for peace in the Middle East. But it is the defence of the homeland which is most on his mind. He's ordered 50,000 reservists to report for duty.
So many have suffered so great a loss, and today we express our nation's sorrow. We come before God to pray for the missing and the dead.
The night brought a new peril, rain. There was a fear it could harden the dust into cement. Already the rubble has to be taken out literally by the bucketful, by volunteers. Firefighters clamber above the ruins to try and make it safe, while not forgetting that there could be people still underneath.
Hello? Is anyone there? Hello?
They listen for every shift of sand, but the rubble is moving all the time.
This is freaking insanity, man. This thing is going to crumble on us, and we're going to be so freaking dead.
We've been running back and forth 5-6 times already. Every time there's a shift, we hear the buildings moan. Guys start running like crazy. This is the south side of the building. This is the most dangerous area. The Marriott over here is in danger of collapsing. This, I believe, is building 7 here that's in danger of collapsing.
We're being hampered by the weather. We're being hampered by the buildings, and it's kind of rough right now. We're doing the best we can.
The hospitals have taken in far fewer people than they expected. This was a disaster where people walked away if they didn't die. Those who got out of the World Trade Center remember.
We started going down, and I remember when we were going down, I looked at the wall because the doors lock on certain floors for fire safety when you're in the fire escape. And I remember looking, and it said 16 and 13 were the re-entry points. And we were moving, and people were saying, I don't know what prayer it was, but though I walked through the valley of the shadow, people were just chanting it.
The police are out in force too. This is, after all, a scene of crime. A monstrous crime where the number murdered is still not known. As Union Square turns into a spontaneous shrine, the man who was once president said it is not about numbers, it is about lives, as he walked visibly moved through New York.
I'm quite sure that when they conclude their investigation, the president will tell us what he found out, what he intends to do, and why. And I believe it'll be the right decision based on the available options to him.
Fire broke out again in the ruined wing of the Pentagon. The damage to the headquarters of the most powerful military force on Earth, bringing a surge of new recruits.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
One poll shows that 86% of Americans support military action and 69% are willing to accept heavy casualties. But for now, they do not know their enemy. They know only what their enemy can do. And after exhausting hours, the men and sniffer dogs looking for survivors must know that their work is done. David Loyne, BBC News.
The U.S. Department of Justice has released a list of the hijackers it suspects of commandeering the 4 planes involved in Tuesday's terrorist attacks. The list includes 19 persons. American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center early on Tuesday morning. Among those aboard that flight was Mohammed Atta. The German authorities have identified him as being tied to Islamic fundamentalist groups who planned attacks on American targets. United Airlines Flight 175 destroyed the South Tower. Marwan al-Shehi was among those on board. He lived with Mohammed Atta in Germany, and they attended the same flying schools. American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. The Justice Department initially suspected there were 4 hijackers on board, but today they added Hani Hajur to the list, another man suspected to have trained as a pilot. And United Airlines Flight 93 came down in a field in Pennsylvania. Ziad Jarai was among the men on board that flight. He's also thought to have been a trained pilot. Well, justice officials say they believe dozens more people offered support from the ground. Well, let's cross now to the Pentagon in Washington to join our correspondent, John Lyne. John, we have 19 names released by the authorities in the United States. Do you get a sense that they are closing in on who may be behind this attack?
Yes, they definitely have a lot of evidence gained from the flights, and they're getting more evidence now from the flight recorders they've recovered from the wreckage here at the Pentagon. They've got a lot of information, a lot of names. What the United States is very deliberately doing is not making any hasty announcements. They're assembling the evidence, assembling the links, working out which groups and who is behind it, and then they're going to announce it to the world, and then they're going to try and recruit the world's support for the action they choose to take.
And do they believe that the flight recorders that they found from the crash in Pittsburgh will be the most valuable evidence? They may not be able to find the flight recorders from, for example, in New York?
Well, they've got the flight recorder from the crash in Pennsylvania, but not the voice recorder. But from here in the Pentagon, they've actually recovered both the flight recorder and the voice recorder, which could be extremely valuable because, of course, the Pentagon wasn't, it is thought, the original intended target for this hijacked plane. They perhaps were going to try and aim for the White House or the Capitol building. So once they've been able to replay the conversations from the cockpit, they may learn more about that.
We see some activity behind you, John. The Pentagon, of course, burst into flames earlier today. Exactly what's been going on today?
Yeah, well, actually, just a minute ago, I believe the President flew past in Marine One. Can't quite confirm that because there's a couple of helicopters with similar markings. But the President seems to have wanted another quick look from the air on his way to New York. There was a fire earlier on. It sparked up during the night, was put out fairly quickly. After that, they recovered those flight data recorders. And now they're working inside to shore up the building and, of course, to recover the bodies.
And of course, this is no longer a rescue operation. No hope at all of finding survivors.
Only the remotest hope. I think the rescue workers are reluctant to say that, but that is the word certainly from Pentagon officials. The impact was too great, the fire was too great, and in fact, nobody was recovered after just a very few hours after the attack itself.
John Lyon, thank you very much for another update from just outside the damaged Pentagon headquarters in Washington. That was the scene today in Washington, and we understand President George W. Bush is now in the air. He's flying towards New York to make his first visit to the site of the devastating attack in that city, the Big Apple, shaken very badly by the devastating strikes. He'll want to send a very strong message to the people of New York that they will be protected. Well, in the United States, it was a day of prayer and remembrance, and across Europe as well and beyond, hundreds of millions of people stopped in their tracks, stopped what they were doing in the day to pay their respects to those that died. It's not clear how many in Tuesday's attacks.
11 o'clock this morning, the nation stands still. For some, there were special reasons why this silence carried so much meaning, an intense sympathy for America from people who have themselves been the victims of terrorism. At schools, the silence was observed by those whose lives may well be altered by the events of Tuesday, young people growing up in a more sombre, perhaps a more dangerous world. And, of course, nowhere was the silence more intense than in the City of London, mourning the loss of so many friends. And it was in the city, an hour after the silence, that thousands gathered outside St. Paul's Cathedral to glimpse the service of remembrance. The congregation was led by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. The service began with the American national anthem.
hopeful for the people of America. Hopeful that as ruins are rebuilt, so also a shaken people will be restored.
As the royal family left the cathedral, similar services were going on around Europe. At his summer residence, the Pope prayed alone in his private chapel. And in virtually every nation on the continent, there was a show of solidarity with America. Such a widespread gesture of shock and sympathy has simply never been seen before. A continent has used silence with eloquent effect. Justin Webb, BBC News.
And now let's return to Washington, where the American Secretary of State Colin Powell is giving a briefing at the State Department.
We continue to work hard to build the coalition that you heard me talking about for the last several days and to get this campaign plan in place. We talked about it at the Cabinet meeting this morning. The President is very pleased with the work the Cabinet has been doing, and we can start to see the air traffic system come back up. We begin to see the relief efforts picking up speed. We're very grateful for the resolution that has come from the Senate and the support that the Congress is giving to our efforts. It shows the United States as a nation, as a people, coming together in this time of crisis and showing our determination to move forward deliberately and decisively to deal with this particular incident as well as the broader threat represented by world terrorism. I have been in touch with a number of officials in addition to the Cabinet meeting and the very moving memorial service that we just had up at the National Cathedral. Earlier in the morning, I spoke to the Foreign Minister of India, Mr. Singh, and was very pleased to receive an exceptionally strong statement of support from the Indian government, and we had heard that previously, but he confirmed it this morning. I've also had conversations with Portuguese Foreign Minister, the Saudi Foreign Minister, Moroccan, Tunisian Foreign Ministers, my colleague, Foreign Minister Tanaka of Japan. I'll be speaking to the Israeli Defense Minister in a few moments, and I have a call into the Syrian Foreign Minister. And this will continue throughout the day for me. But beyond that, we have instructed our ambassadors around the world to go in and talk to their colleagues in those capitals to let them know how serious we are about this and begin to set the stage for any other requests we might have for them with respect to what we do as we go forward. In addition, our regional assistant secretaries here in the State Department have been inviting in ambassadors resident here in Washington to discuss the situation with them and to receive any questions they may have and to pass on any guidance that we have available to them. As you know, we are waiting to hear from President Musharraf of Pakistan, and I'm quite encouraged that the Pakistani government is taking this so seriously and so deliberately, and our ambassador is waiting for a reaction from them. I might also say that I'm pleased that the actions of the Australian government in activating the ANZUS Treaty as an expression of support and a little similar to what NATO did, but those alliances that we hold dear and have used so effectively to keep us together as friendly nations over these many years are now, seems to me, paying off as people come forward to help us. I'm also pleased that expressions of support we have received from countries such as Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and others are coming in. I don't have all of them on my list or in my memory, and Richard Boucher will, in the course of the day, let you know who we have heard from and what kind of responses we have received from them. And let me just stop there and take a couple of questions before I have to make a phone call.
Any indications of what the Pakistan, whether you get a positive response from Pakistan? You're going to call the Syrian. Any indications yet of their position?
Yes, the Syrians, President Assad sent to President Bush a very strong letter of support in efforts against terrorism. Now, of course, we have had a mixed relationship with Syria over the years, and in the course of my conversation, hopefully this afternoon with my colleague, I'll pursue the spirit of the letter that President Assad sent to President Bush and see where that takes us.
And any indications from the Pakistanis, even though there's no final answer?
So far, I am very encouraged, but I think it's best that I do wait for a final answer.
Mr. Secretary, Indian media says that, that government handed over some maps to you today of guerrilla camps and other training areas that Afghanistan is said to be using. Can you confirm that that's...
I can't confirm it. I just don't know. Richard could chase that down for you, but I can't confirm it here. It wasn't mentioned to me in my phone call at about 9 or 9:30 or 10, whenever I had, or about 10:30, I guess it was, with the Indian Foreign Minister.
Mr. Secretary, we've heard a lot, yourself and other cabinet members and officials say, as we reach out to countries and ask for help, you're either with us or you're against us. Now, of course, we hope that all countries are be with us, but if we ask for something from a country, we ask them to root out terrorism in all its forms or to provide logistical or any type of other support that we need for any eventual military response. If they decline, if they say that they won't do what the U.S. asks, what are the consequences for, quote, being against us?
I think we have to be careful as we go forward, and we intend to be. We're talking with countries that are friendly to us, and we will present requests to them and see what they are able to do within their capacity and within their political circumstances. But if we find a particular country, especially those that might be serving as a haven or is a well-known supporter of this kind of activity, and they are simply unresponsive, and we deem that unresponsiveness to be contributing to additional terrorism or to the fertile ground in which terrorism thrives, then that will certainly affect the kind of relationship we're going to have with them in the future. I am not threatening so much as I am saying this has become a new benchmark, a new way of measuring the relationship and what we can do together in the future and what kind of support we can provide to you in the future across a whole range of issues and activities. Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, the last 2 days you've been saying that how important you think it is that despite the events here, that the tragic events here, that it's still very, very important for the Israelis and the Palestinians to have high-level meetings between Chairman Arafat and former Mr. Perez. Now, Prime Minister Sharon has now called that meeting off. And secondly, you're speaking to the Israeli Defense Minister later. Are you going to bring up his comments that were quoted in an Israeli newspaper this morning, in which he said that the disasters in New York and here were a catastrophe for Arafat because the Israelis had killed 14 Palestinians since then and no one had noticed?
I don't know what we'll discuss. I haven't seen those comments, but I know him rather well, and I'm sure we'll have many things to discuss, but I won't prejudge what I might raise or what he might raise and announce it before he raises it or I raise it. I would still hope that a way is found for the Israelis and the Palestinians to meet. When they meet is a judgment for them to make. We have two leaders who have to judge their own interest. We believe a meeting is important to get the process started. This conflict isn't going away, and I don't think it's going to be solved by continuing conflict between the two sides. So I hope that conditions will present themselves soon so that a meeting can begin. But I think it is also fair to say that the events of the 11th of September have fundamentally changed the way in which people look at terrorism and acts of terrorism. Andrea?
Secretary Pell, as your strategy to fight global terrorism begins to take shape and as these international coalitions that you've been trying to build solidify, it's obviously a very different war that you're preparing to fight in that the enemy is not in one country. Could you explain this to us?
Yeah, I was raised a soldier, and you're trained. There is the enemy occupying a piece of ground. We can define it in time, space, and other dimensions, and you can assemble forces and go after it. This is different. The enemy is in many places. The enemy is not looking to be found. The enemy is hidden. The enemy is very often right here within our own country. And so you have to design a campaign plan that goes after that kind of enemy. And it isn't always blunt force military, although that is certainly an option. It may well be that the diplomatic efforts, political efforts, legal, financial, other efforts may be just as effective against that kind of an enemy as would military force be. And the point the President made this morning is that the whole cabinet's involved, and we're going to use all the tools and weapons at our disposal to fight this campaign and to win this war. I only have time for one more, and I apologize. Let me say, who haven't I? Go.
Do you have a message for the Taliban? Yes.
Is it a vote? That's the question? No. All right. The message is, to the extent that you are providing havens, support, encouragement, and other resources to organizations such as the organization headed by Mr. Osama bin Laden, that is attacking civilization, that is killing innocent people. And I would give this message to any other regime in any other country that might be doing similar things. To the extent that you are doing these sorts of things, even though we have not yet, notwithstanding words like prime suspect, we have not yet identified Osama bin Laden as the direct perpetrator, but the evidence, we have a lot of evidence is mounting, which will allow us to determine in the near future who it is. But he certainly is the leader of that kind of organization, and to the extent that governments such as the Taliban government in Afghanistan support such things, you need to understand you cannot separate your activities from the activities of these perpetrators. And in our response, we will have to take into account not only the perpetrators, but those who provide haven, support, inspiration, financial, and other assets to the perpetrators, as the President said in his very first set of remarks some days ago. Thank you. I do have to go. Thank you.
The American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, addressing another news briefing in Washington. He was asked whether he had a message for the Taliban, and he said he would say to them, as to any other country which may be harboring terrorists, that they should now begin to stop these activities. He emphasized, of course, that even though Osama bin Laden, the Saudi dissident believed to be living in Afghanistan, was the prime suspect, he said that their investigation wasn't completed yet, although he said evidence was mounting and they hope to complete it soon. The Secretary of State gave an update on the kind of contacts that America is having with its allies, with its friends, talking to ambassadors, receiving messages from around the world. He, of course, mentioned a message from Pakistan's President, General Pervez Musharraf, and said they were still waiting to see exactly what form Pakistan's cooperation would take. So the investigation is continuing, and over 4,000 FBI agents are engaged in what's being described as the world's biggest ever manhunt. Our correspondent John Sopa looks at the various leads the FBI are now following.
At all the crash sites, investigators have been desperate to get their hands on the black box flight recorders. Of the 4 planes involved in the attack, one crashed near Pittsburgh, another at the Pentagon outside Washington, and from the 2 which went into the Twin Towers in New York, there has been no sign whatsoever of the black boxes. But from the plane which crashed in a field near Pittsburgh, the vital data recordings have been recovered. What's significant about this is that it should tell us whether it was passenger action which stopped the hijackers from reaching either the target of Camp David or Air Force One. In Washington, the 2 black boxes from the plane which flew into the side of the Pentagon have also been retrieved.
The condition of the black boxes, the voice recorder was described as somewhat damaged on the exterior. The data recorder was described as being charred on the exterior. I'm told by those who know about these things that that really doesn't mean anything at this point, that those boxes must be downloaded and the data taken off to determine whether or not any real damage has occurred. And I do not know what the status of the boxes are right now, other than the fact that they are now part of the federal investigation into this horrible incident.
Well, the FBI have posted a list of 52 people wanted for questioning, but there have also been a number of arrests. In Florida, off the coast of Miami this morning, the Coast Guard boarded a cruise ship and arrested 2 men. Meanwhile, police forces around the world are also tracking down those who they think could help with the American investigation. In Belgium, 4 members of an Islamic group were arrested today. Uzi submachine guns were found. North to the Netherlands, 4 members of a similar group were arrested in Rotterdam. In London, one man was arrested at Heathrow under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. He's now been freed. And in Germany, an airport worker who was arrested by Hamburg police in a high-profile raid has also been released too. And in this highly tense and febrile atmosphere, US police made a number of arrests on 2 planes about to take off from New York airports yesterday. One of those on board describes the terrifying moments when the police burst in.